Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. The topic of today's video is going to focus on what the DSM-V doesn't tell us about post-traumatic stress disorder that we really wish it did. Now, the reason why we're making this video is largely because PTSD has been incredibly misunderstood. Sometimes these misunderstandings lead to mental health service consumers being misdiagnosed at best or feeling thoroughly gaslit by their providers at worst. Unfortunately, some of these misunderstandings also seem to appear in the DSM itself, which I'll go ahead and review to demonstrate a little bit about what I'm talking about. If you find that something you see here resonates with you, someone you know, or are a provider who has experienced these firsthand for yourself, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. One more note I want to make about this topic before I speak on it is that I'm going to speak more slowly in this video to give some of the ideas we're going to discuss today some time and space to land more fully. I can't tell you how many times I've had clients who meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder come in and tell me that they have a history of diagnosis that included some personality disorder. From my own clinical work, I've also seen personality disorders disproportionately assigned to people of color despite only having worked with their providers for anywhere from 1 to 3 sessions. If that sounds shocking to you, maybe it shouldn't. I'm going to briefly read what the DSM-V has to say about antisocial personality disorder. To briefly find some common language here, the DSM-V describes antisocial personality disorder as a pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. Common features are failure to conform with laws, the use of deceit, impulsivity, frequent assaultive behavior, and lack of remorse. It goes on to say that APD is more common among substance users, which, as we know, substance use disorders are also high among populations with PTSD, and that APD appears to be associated with low socioeconomic status and urban settings. I want to take a pause here because the DSM-V just told us who gets an APD diagnosis versus who gets a PTSD diagnosis, and their designation here largely lines up with my own experiences in community mental health. When the manual we're using to diagnose mental illness in itself shows bias towards the same people it's supposed to be helping, it gets much trickier to trust that your provider hasn't written you off when these diagnoses are haphazardly applied. Because the pattern of disregard for and violation of rights could very well be sanction-seeking behavior that's consistent with 2 of the diagnostic criteria used for PTSD, which read as follows: irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects, and reckless or self-destructive behavior. When we compare the criteria above, it seems to suggest that whether a mental health service consumer receives a diagnosis of PTSD, APD, or another associated personality disorder, such as borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, seems more dependent on the bias or lack thereof of their provider versus something that is more solidly grounded in scientific evidence. Now, the good news here is that the DSM-V-TR did update their guidance on antisocial personality disorder, seemingly reversing course in some ways, noting individuals from some socially oppressed groups may be at higher risk for misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of antisocial personality disorder because they are more likely to be misdiagnosed with conduct disorder in adolescence, which is a requirement for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Despite this, it still feels correct to include this consideration in this video due to the fact that there are still providers out there that don't keep up with new developments in the field. It's important for all of us to consider how our biases impact not only how we diagnose, but how these diagnoses may reinforce harmful narratives mental health consumers may have about themselves. It can feel like there's a new struggle every week. In between hypervigilance and agitation, there can be one more symptom of PTSD that gets a little less airtime. In my own clinical practice and when helping clients better understand their own symptoms, I've used the expression monster of the week syndrome to describe the feeling of hyperfixation that happens when encountering a triggering or stressful situation. The reason why we say monster of the week is to describe just how long these feelings of agitation can last for. as a stressor that is normally transient for some can last a day, 2 days, or even a week, only to be supplanted by another stressor the following week. Let's dive into an example of what this might look like. Roger has maintained employment for over 10 years as a billing specialist at a nearby veterans clinic. Roger's relationships with his coworkers are mostly positive in nature, but Roger finds himself upset when one of his colleagues asks him to resubmit a claim on their behalf. Roger notices that this colleague seems exasperated when approaching him with this request, but the colleague doesn't voice this exasperation before heading home early. While billing mishaps happen from time to time, and Roger is no stranger to them, Roger takes issue with how his colleague approached him about the billing mishap. Roger didn't broach the subject in the moment, and as a result is left with only his own thoughts after the encounter to try and make sense of what just happened. In Roger's mind, his colleague just slammed a rebill submission on his desk, sounding super angry, and promptly left without much dialogue after. To Roger, this means that his colleague must be upset with him, and because his colleague is upset with him, Roger now feels threatened. Now that Roger feels threatened, his mind goes into a defensive position as he tries to think of every other possible instance in which his colleague has either communicated inappropriately or acted improperly. This feeling grows in intensity the following day when Roger notices that his colleague is absent from work. Roger thinks to himself that his colleague must be so upset that he couldn't possibly stand to be around Roger and has taken the day off so the two don't have to interact. Roger finds it near impossible to concentrate on anything other than this issue that's bound to rock the world place, his standing, his colleague's position, and their entire department. That is until Roger finds out that his colleague got sick from food poisoning the day before. Now, Roger starts to put the pieces together and understand his coworker's frustration, the sweat on his brow, his urgency to get out of the building, and the reason he didn't come into work the following day. When he sees his colleague the day after, he takes note of how his colleague approaches him to apologize, saying, "Hey Roger, I'm so sorry I had to jet the other day without chatting some more. I got so sick, but I don't want you to think me leaving quickly was anything to do with you." Roger accepts the apology and is left exhausted, with the emotional residue of his brain working overtime to convince him that the sky was falling. While this is just one example, sometimes the intensity of these incidents can decrease naturally even without an apparent resolution. When they do, they can often feed into our next numbered item. Number 3, hopelessness can be a major feature. While hopelessness is touched upon in the DSM's criteria for major depressive disorder, it's not explicitly named in the criteria for PTSD. The closest we get to naming it is when the DSM lists persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world as a potential symptom for PTSD. People who struggle with hopelessness due to PTSD can often have difficulties differentiating between real and imagined dangers present in the world, others, or themselves. The mental resources needed to stay in this hypervigilant state can feel exhausting and create difficulties for sufferers to attune to their own physical and emotional experiences. As their bodies and minds struggle to pay attention to their internal experiences, an acute focus on potential threats that could come from others, the world, or their own behaviors may exist in its place, such as feelings of high anxiety that they're going to do or say something wrong that will invite harm upon themselves. When the focus is so much on the potential dangers of the world around them, PTSD sufferers can sometimes feel like they're locked in a type of stasis, where nothing feels like it will ever get better. Through this lens, every day feels like just another exercise in surviving, where hypervigilance feels not like a symptom, but a necessary tool to keep alert regarding potential threats. It's due to the brain's messaging that the afflicted need to stay in this state that further generates feelings of hopelessness. If, however, we're able to find and generate safety within our lives, relationships, and our own judgment, we can then begin processing what has actually happened to us and consider the strengths we use to survive the traumas endured. While we've reviewed various PTSD symptoms, this and what the DSM has to say are by no means exhaustive in what presentations may look and feel like. If this video has been helpful to you, or maybe might be to someone you know, please consider tickling that like button and subscribing, as every bit of engagement helps the algorithm get to more folks who may also benefit from the content in this video. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Take care.